Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Starbase Flyover Update. This is episode 9, and we'll be doing a flyover over Starbase, Texas today. Hope you enjoy the flight.
Consider supporting us on Patreon to gain early access to the flyover images the same day they're taken, and the support helps out tremendously with paying for the expenses associated with the flyover. Thank you so much. We'll start this week's episode at the Massey's test site, situated along the Rio Grande River right across from Mexico. Here's a map layout of the locations of the pads, comparing the first flyover taken on July 14th. Now sliding over to a second photo of Massey's taken on July 20th, with quite a few notable changes. Starting off our tour Massey's with a look at the booster cryogenic testing station. After being rolled out 2 weeks ago and undergoing cryogenic testing, we see booster 10 still connected to the pipework from the tank farm via its quick disconnect. This is a good sign pointing to further testing down the road. And thanks to our friends at Labpadre for providing this footage of B10 undergoing its first cryo test, which refers to filling it with cryogenic liquid nitrogen to test its ability to hold fuel while under pressure. Moving down, we see the booster puck shucker, responsible for simulating thrust loads on the thrust puck of the booster, using 13 hydraulic rams. This week, we noticed that the 12 curved pieces have been assembled around the perimeter of the booster puck shucker and are resting on these 12 tubular pieces of steel spotted last week. We speculate this may be a platform for future hydraulic rams to be installed on, although this is just a theory as we haven't yet seen this design before. And over here is where the ship puck shucker and ship 28 are now located. After the duo were rolled out of the high bay on Friday, July 21st, we can expect S28 to undergo the same testing described earlier, but with a smaller number of thrust ramps. Now passing over the two halves of the structural test cage, which is still being prepared to test the payload bay test article in the high bay. In case you don't know how the structural test cage works, it uses pistons to pull laterally on test articles. The pressure created by this effectively simulates and exceeds the loads faced during the re-entry portion of the flight. We also think there may be an element to the testing of S24.2 that involves straps pulling down on the tops of the test article and will simulate max Q forces, although this isn't fully confirmed yet. With the fate of the can crusher still unknown, it remains to be seen what this horizontal black bar will be used for, either as a testing rig or structural support for scrapping are possible. Next up, we move to the Massey's tank farm, where pipework installation has progressed since the last flyover, with connections being made to the 3 horizontal nitrogen storage tanks. Cryogenic testing replicates the real-life fueling of boosters and ships, which means in addition to liquid nitrogen acting as a substitute for methane, liquid oxygen is used as well to simulate and practice LOX loading. Over here, we see a LOX or liquid oxygen tanker connected to the LOX tanks of the Massey's tank farm, yet another sign of a booster cryo testing which we can expect to occur imminently. And that's it for this week's tour Massey's. Now heading north to a vector heading of 30 degrees where we find the Sanchez Site used for construction and assembly of various items. Here is a first photo of Sanchez Site taken on Wednesday, July 14th. And here's a second photo taken on Thursday, July 20th. As always, feel free to scrub back and forth to see more of the differences. Starting off at the left-hand side of Sanchez, we see that the framework of the ground fabrication building is nearing completion, with additional roofing framework being lifted into place the past week. The 2 smaller ends of the building, also known as lean-tos, are nearing completion. The base layer of concrete has been poured, completing the foundation for the left side, and the right side is still pending formwork and rebar, as indicated by this blue vapor barrier seen here. Moving to the right, we see the beginnings of yet another ring stang in the same place where we saw the vertical tank last week, which has since been transported to the launch site. More on that later. Over here, we see the new ring structure still under construction. Last week we saw 10 white structures connected in a circular structure by a single layer of steel. We currently do not know what this assembly will be used for or why it has multiple layers like an onion. This week, additional layers seem to have been added to the structure. Now moving up the image to the middle of Sanchez, home to the pre-assembled Megabay 2 sections before they move to the build site. Over here sits the 2 back corner segments currently being assembled for Level 5 of Megabay 2. After level 5 is fully completed and stacked, just 2 more levels remain until the new mega bay is finally topped out. Over here we see this inventory staging area, which has undergone some organizing since the past week, with some miscellaneous pieces of hardware being moved off of this concrete pad. Next, we move all the way up to the previous location of the scrapyard. We notice that new formwork is being constructed for a concrete pad whose purpose is unknown at this time. Finally, moving up, we see the rocket garden, which has changed enough in the past week to warrant another labeled image. From left to right, we see Booster 11, Booster 4, SN15, Ship 20, and Ship 26, as well as the nose cone and payload section of Ship 27, which was just scrapped on the morning of the flyover on Thursday. But this isn't the most surprising thing we saw about S-27. Indeed, it seems like the forward dome of S-27 has imploded. It's likely this was the reason behind the ship scrapping, though we're not certain yet as to why this happened. Leave your speculation in the comments below. And that's it for Sanchez. Now banking right to the build site. Here's a labeled map of the site. Here we have a shot comparing the first flyover of the build site from July 14th. Now sliding over to show another few seconds of the photo from July 20th to compare the changes. First, let's kick off this week's tour of the build site with a look at the Mega Bay 2 construction. This week we saw the completion of the 4th level with the 3rd and 4th sections lifted. It's worth mentioning that the LR 11,000 crane we see in the middle of the bay had been laid down for reconfiguration, extending it before work on level 5 starts. Looking slightly to the right, we see that a second nav flap has been delivered along with the one we saw last week. We can expect these to be installed on Ship 29, which is currently stacked in the high bay. Now let's slide over to this angle showing the interior of the older sibling Mega Bay 1. Starting from the right, we see that Booster 9 is no longer present after it was rolled out to the launch site on the morning of July 20th. Better seen in this series of images courtesy of SpaceX, the rollout of Booster 9 marks a major step in its test campaign before its launch. We can expect what is slated to be the booster for IFT-2 to be crowd tested, spin primed, and finally static fired at the launch site before launch in a few months. And this rollout is likely one of many before the big day. We can also see in this photo that Booster 12 is still in 2 halves in the Mega Bay waiting to be stacked. We now move left to the high bay, used by SpaceX to construct the second stage of Starship. We notice that Ship 28 is no longer here, after it was moved to the Massey's test site for crowd testing on the puck shucker stand due to the lack of an available crane at Massey's to lift S-28. Therefore, it was directly lifted onto the puck shucker at the build site before the duo were transported to Massey's test site. Meanwhile, Ship 29 is still being worked on in the back right corner of the high bay. And on the left, we see that Ship 30 has started construction, with its payload bay being moved onto the turntable, with its nose cone joining it on the 21st of July. Now we move past the mid bay, home to the S-22 nose cone and E-dome assembly where we've seen no major external changes. In front of the mid bay is a ring yard, where we notice something rather strange. This what we believe to be a new hot staging ring design after the previous design was scrapped a couple of weeks ago. Here's a render by the space engineer showing the new ring design next to the old one. And here's what it looks like when installed on the booster. Next, we move on to the Star Factory, which is currently undergoing its second phase of expansion. Starting at the top left of the image, we see that roofing work on the Star Factory has progressed since last week. Meanwhile, the framework being erected to support the roofing panels has continued to expand further left, leaving just one more row left to be erected. Moving down, we also notice additional roofing framework staged here after we saw this area being poured with concrete last week. And in the area closer to Highway 4, work has progressed on the footings, which will act as foundations for the future Star Factory. Additional footings have been dug and poured, with this one on the left still not poured with concrete. We also notice that these smaller footings in between the normal sized ones, which are there to account for the taller height of the Star Factory in this area. Here's yet another render by the space engineer showing the massive scale of Star Factory once Phase 2 of the expansion is complete. Wrapping up our tour of the build site, we take a look at the Starlink processing facility. As seen in this ground photo taken by me on Saturday the 22nd, at least 62 Starlink version 2s are sitting inside the Starlink processing facility waiting to fly on Starship, which we can expect to happen shortly after the Starship successfully gets to orbit. Starship's second flight is getting nearer every day, so make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the informative flyover updates. With that, let's move on to the launch site. Next up is the launch site, where we've seen a barrage of changes this past week as the steel plate installation wraps up. Here's a few seconds of the shot comparing the first flyover of the launch site from July 14th. Here's another few seconds of the photo from July 20th to compare the changes. We'll start off our tour of the launch site by checking up on Suborbital Launch Site, where nothing significant has taken place. We can see the LR-11000 crane is still attached to Ship 25. This is to provide structural support while workers are working inside the tanks. To the left of Pad B, a trench has been dug from the suborbital tank farm over to the land expansion where Pad C is planned to be located. Moving to the right, we can see the middle of the launch site, looking at the area where future horizontal cryogenic storage tanks are due to be installed. We can see the exposing of the pilings on the second strip of foundations has been completed and rebar has started to be installed to form the pow cap. Now moving to the back of the launch site, we can see that a new tank has been installed on the hexagonal concrete pad that was spotted last week. The purpose of this new tank is unknown at the moment. Now rotating over to this other angle, we notice that formwork is being constructed behind the existing horizontal gas tanks for more pedestals for what we assume to be more high-pressure gas tanks to further increase the power of the deluge system. We also notice that the T-vents above the horizontal water deluge tanks have received a coat of paint. Now zooming in closer to the orbital launch tower, where a brand new plate has been installed to protect the drawworks during launch, after the last one was damaged by concrete thrown up by the thrust of 30 Raptors during Starship's first integrated flight. And now looking at the base of the tower itself, what we assume to be a new coat of paint has been applied to the orbital launch tower. A lot of paintwork was done this past week, including on the legs of the orbital launch mount. Starting off at the much-anticipated orbital launch mount, we first look at the base, where we see that a giant power rebar has appeared on this currently unpoured part of the pad. This rebar was laid following the installation of various pipework connecting the deluge system to the water-cooled steel plates, as seen in this older image taken last week. Going back to the future, we notice additional rebar has been installed on this part of the pad, and we can expect concrete pouring to occur throughout this week, with a final layer of fondag or high-strength concrete to be poured on top of that. Now moving up to the actual orbital launch mount itself, we notice that large amounts of scaffolding have been removed in preparation to receive Booster 9. This scaffolding was previously here to allow workers easy access to various systems in and around the OLM for easy inspection and replacement. Its removal is promising sign that work on the OLM, including the Raptor quick disconnects, stabilization pins, and other systems are finished and ready for booster testing. Speaking of boosters, we see Booster 9 in between the chopsticks after being transported to the launch site. It was lifted onto the OLM just a few hours after this flyover at around 10 p.m. Starbase time on July 20th. After a false start, it was slowly lifted by the chopsticks in the first ever lift after the flight of Starship, verifying strength of these chopsticks and its drawworks. Thanks to SpaceX for posting these images to the bottom of Booster 9, lit up by the powerful light of the SpaceX inspection drones. Here's a series of ground photos I took of Booster 9 during and after its lift, after already conducting 2 cryo tests earlier in the year. We can also expect Booster 9 to undergo several spin prime tests and static fires prior to launch, probably with a few rollouts in between. When do you expect Booster 9 and Ship 25 to launch? Leave a comment and let us know your estimates. Now moving to the top right side of the launch site, we notice that a new water retention pond is being constructed. This will have the responsibility of none other than retaining water during heavy rain as well as deluge testing. Next up, we see that the engine choke pond has been fully poured with concrete this past week. This may also take on an additional role of being a water drainage pond just like the one next to it. We end this week's tour of the launch site by looking to the area in front of the orbital tank farm. We've seen cleanup work occurring over here with the welding and fabrication tents being taken down since the last flyover. And that's it for our Starbase Flyover update. Thank you for choosing to fly with RGV Aerial Photography. If you like what you saw today, please subscribe so you don't miss out on the new videos each week, and also leave a thumbs up. Also, please consider supporting our flyovers through Patreon to gain access to our flyover gallery the same day it occurs. Finally, join our public Discord server to discuss Starship and space in general with like-minded fans around the world. Link is in the description down below. This is Mauricio, and that's all for now.